Again, to withhold questions and comments until the question period. This is the fourth lecture in this course, and it is devoted today to Kant's political philosophy. Kant's whole philosophy consists of his attempts to answer a set of basic questions which he has asked of himself. The first question, you will remember, is, what can we know? He answered this question in his epistemology and metaphysics. The second question, what ought we do? He answered in his ethics. The third question, what can we hope for? He answered in the last part of his ethics. He has yet to answer a fourth question, what is man? His answer to that question comes through luminously in his political philosophy, to which today's meeting is devoted. I hope to show in the course of the lecture that Kant's political philosophy is fundamentally consistent with and follows from his epistemology, his metaphysics, and his ethics. In other words, it's not an accidental aberration. It's not that something temperamental or some fad of the times intervened and prevented him from doing something else. He is fundamentally consistent throughout, although, as I will point out, there are inconsistencies in places. We have seen how Kant drew a radical distinction between appearance and reality. Appearance is the world of space, time, and causality. It is studied by reason in its theoretical employment, or its theoretical function. And the result of such study is called knowledge. Man's knowledge can attain certainty. Therefore, the answer to the question, what can we know, is we can know the world of appearance, that is, the world of space, time, and causality. However, man asks himself a second question, what ought we do? What answer shall we give to this? Kant maintains that the answer cannot be found in the world of appearance. We can study all of science and not come up with a clue as to how man is to earn moral worth. However, man must act. Therefore, he must find an answer to this question, the question of what we ought to do. We have seen that theoretical reason, confined as it is to the study of appearance, cannot help us. But we are looking for guidance, and insofar as all guidance consists of spelled out directions or general rules, that guidance must be rational. For the essence of rationality, if you remember his definition of rationality, is conformity to general rules. There must therefore be some other function of reason, some function other than the theoretical. There is indeed, says Kant, and it is the practical reason which does give us directions as to how to attain moral worth. These directions are imperative, as all moral directions should be. Yet they are rational in the sense of giving us universal and necessary judgments. That is, they are rational in his sense of rational, not in ours, which is conformity to reality. The imperatives are not conditional upon anything in the world of appearance. They must therefore have their source in the world of reality as it is in itself. Am I going too fast by any chance? Man has therefore access to the world of reality as it is in itself, and the access is through his moral consciousness. Recognition of the ethical domain has certain consequences. To attain moral worth, man must subject himself to the categorical imperative. This means he must subordinate to the practical reason all considerations derived from the world of appearance, including in action all his desires, all his happiness, and in knowledge his theoretical doubts about free will, immortality, and God. He must submit to the primacy of the practical, which in Kant's philosophy means to the dictates of practical reason, not only in practical matters such as ethical obedience, but even in theoretical matters, where he is called on to postulate the freedom of the will, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God. Man is therefore a divided self. He is called upon to do and to believe certain things, whether or not he wishes to, or whether or not he can theoretically accept them, whether he can prove them, you see. He's called on to do certain things which he might not like to do, and to believe certain things which he might believe not to be justified or verifiable. Now, man doesn't always do this. He frequently adopts policies of action, or maxims, as Kant calls it, that allow him to violate the dictates of practical reason, like on Saturday night. That man does this is not part of his logical essence as rational animal. We cannot deduce it from the definition of man. We learn it by experience. We learn by experience that man has what Kant calls an evil nature. This failure to subordinate his otherwise innocent animal or phenomenal nature to his noumenal self is a failure of will. In other words, your impulses are innocent and natural, but unless you deny them in accordance with the categorical imperative, you are a sinner. Yet all men are morally defective, not just some. We do not know why, Kant says in his book called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. We do not know why. Now here, on this point, Kant stands in the tradition of Paul, Augustine, Luther, and Calvin. And he stands there in clear distinction from his successors, such as, above all, Hegel, but also in contrast to the German idealists generally. Note that Kant's argument is drawn from two premises. One, that morality consists of general principles detached from the spatio-temporal world. And three, that men often, constantly, and predominantly violate them. In other words, the voice is coming from somewhere out there beyond what?
One is three. You said premise. The last thing you mentioned was premise three.
No, I just meant 1 and 2.
1 and 2. Did I have 3?
No, you just said it by mistake.
Oh, I said 3,
Clear now. Go ahead.
but am I clear? How many premises have we gone through?
2.
2, okay. So man is continually at the crossroads, but he takes the path of evil more frequently. Now, if man's violations of morality concerned moral worth alone, the worst result would be the division of the world into saints and sinners. And then in the next world, the saints would go marching in, you see. But there's another problem. Besides the problem of the division of men into saints and sinners on the moral scale, there's the fact that we have to live together in the spatio-temporal world. You have to get along. And sometimes you have to go along to get along, Kant in effect says. Men must live together in society, and society, if it is to exist at all, must impose certain rules which coordinate the activities of men so that they can live together in harmony. In other words, so there won't be crashes at every intersection. This need to live together in harmony is absolute, in the sense that society is an absolute necessity for man, and therefore any society is better than none. He shares this premise with Rousseau and with Hobbes. And if you include the state in society, he hardly shares it with Locke. Locke would say that only in a very reserved way, if at all. So Kant accepts the necessity of society as an absolute datum, and he proceeds in his usual fashion to ask what we must presuppose in order to make society possible, what we must presuppose in an a priori way, of course, in order to make society not only possible but workable. When he asks himself this question about presuppositions, he finds himself suddenly faced with two facts which he must bring into relation with one another. The necessity of external order in society is one fact, and the imperfect nature of man, the so-called evil nature of man, is another fact. Now, this is not necessary in ethics. If we were dealing with ethics alone, we could simply say there are certain ethical duties. Some men fulfill them. They are morally worthy. Cheers for them. Others violate them. They are morally unworthy. Hisses for them. In politics, however, the situation is different. We cannot be content with cheers and hisses. If we were, there would be collisions, as I said a moment ago, at every street corner all the time. In politics, the rules must be enforced. Politics deals with force, with coercion. Kant is very concerned with bringing ethics and politics together so that we can have a morally justified state. He does this in the following way. He says that there is one overall subject matter of morality, which is concerned with what man is commanded to do by absolute general principles. I'll repeat that. There is one overall subject matter of morality, which is concerned with what man is commanded to do by absolute general principles. This overall subject matter of morality is divided into two sub-areas. The first sub-area is ethics, where man is commanded to do his duty out of the motive of duty alone, wholly regardless of penalty or reward. The second is justice, or right, or Recht, capital R-E-C-H-T, which means in German, right, justice, law. The second area of morality is justice, under which man is simply commanded to do his duty, regardless of motive and under penalty of arrest. Rauschen verboten. Both ethics and justice are moral. Ethics is based on the nature of man as rational, that is, as rule-observing, for its own sake. Justice is based on the necessity for social harmony, which necessity is considered together with man's evil nature, his ethical imperfection. right or justice is not concerned with the aims which people are carrying out. It is concerned with ensuring that everyone has the freedom to carry out any aims by actions that do not impede the freedom of others to carry out their aims, whatever they may be. I'm going to repeat that. Justice is not concerned with the aims which people are carrying out. It is concerned with ensuring that everyone has the freedom to carry out any aims by actions that do not impede the freedom of others to carry out their aims, whatever they may be. Kant formulates the principle in the following way. Recht, right, is, quote, the aggregate of those conditions under which the will of one person can be conjoined with the will of another person according to a universal law of freedom. Requote, the right is the aggregate of those conditions under which the will of one person can be conjoined with the will of another person according to a universal law of freedom, unquote. Now, this later became a basic doctrine of continental or European classical liberalism, and it came to influence John Stuart Mill. Kant is saying that freedom in the political sense is not freedom to act in a certain way, but a freedom not to be prevented from acting in whatever way we wish, provided we do not interfere with the freedom of others to act in whatever way they wish. Granted a formula like this, and it is easy to see why so many classical liberals and libertarians speak of this freedom which they advocate as negative freedom. Given Kant's formula, it is easy to see why they talk about the kind of freedom they advocate as negative freedom. Statists of all types have gladly adopted this phrase to characterize classical liberalism of certain types and libertarianism of certain types. Statists of all types have gladly adopted this phrase and have asked whether we can be content, after all, with mere negative freedoms. Poor and rich alike, they say, have the negative freedom of sleeping undisturbed under bridges. What is needed, they say, is positive freedom, like the freedom of having a heated shelter. Bread first. Ayn Rand was correct in saying that the basic rights of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness are simply positive rights to act in pursuit of certain essential goals set by man's nature, goals which may be achieved without coercion. It is a basic error. Now I'm giving my stand on this, not Kant. It's a basic error on the part of some would-be defenders of liberty to take liberty as a primary. This error was, I think, derived from Kant. To return to Kant's argument, however, he is trying to deduce a priori the proper function of the state. The state's function is coercion. Kant believes that coercion should have a limited function in human life. It should not extend to purely ethical matters, since that would involve the judgment of people's motives. Remember, justice or Recht is concerned with people's external behavior, not with their motives, with the fact that they do or do not carry out certain actions, not whether they do or do not carry them out of the motive of doing their duty. Coercion should not extend to purely ethical matters, since that would involve the judgment of people's motives. Such institutions as the Inquisition would necessarily be ruled out. For instance, in the time of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, when many Jews and Muslims were forcibly converted to Christianity, some of them were raised to the office of bishop in the Catholic Church. And some of these bishops, former Jews or Muslims, were arrested on the ground that when saying Mass, they did not really intend to, they did not have the true motive of transforming the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, or when ordaining priests, they did not have the true intention of ordaining priests, and that was regarded as a social danger. Now you see, Kant is taking the opposite tack here. He's saying that things like the Inquisition would necessarily be ruled out. If Kant were alive in the 20th century, he would have to reject totalitarianism, such as Nazism or communism, since they involve the imposition of a state-chosen ethics, a state-chosen ethic which goes to motive. The only proper function of the state, according to Kant, is to preserve external order. Quote, "The state requires me to allow another to be free, even though I am quite indifferent to his freedom." Unquote. This requirement is a duty. The state requires me to act in accordance with this duty, but not out of respect for the duty. I can inwardly thumb my nose at the duty if I want, so far as the principles of justice are concerned. The state does not properly act to promote virtue. Is there such a thing as an intrinsically fair price that a virtuous man should charge, or an intrinsically fair wage? Well, if there is, says Kant, the state should not intervene to enforce it. The market, says Kant, should be allowed to proceed unhampered by the true value of the goods exchanged, if there is any such thing as true value, apart from market value. This is essentially the concept of the state as a traffic policeman, or as Nozick would call it, a night watchman. The German philosophers of the 19th century were to disagree vigorously with Kant on this issue. Kant is thus, in one sense, an advocate of the limited state. We'll see later that he modifies this in certain matters. He advocates the limited state on a priori grounds, from the premises that social order is necessary, that we cannot base social order on virtue, but must base it on coercion, that the state is the only proper agent of such coercion, that the scope of coercion is necessarily limited, and finally that the power of the state must therefore be limited. I'll go over that argument now from his premises to the argument to classical liberalism of what I call the continental type. He advocates a limited state on the a priori ground that social order is necessary. That's premise one. Premise two, that we cannot base social order on virtue, but must base it on coercion. Premise three, that the state is the only proper agent of such coercion. Premise four, that the scope of coercion is necessarily limited. You can't peer into people's motives. The policeman can't do that. And finally, conclusion that the power of the state must therefore be limited. Kant is therefore committed to the limited state under the concept of right. We shall see later how he modifies this position. Now we come to the nature and justification of the state. Kant defines the state as, quote, "the union of a great number of men under the rule of law," unquote. the union of a great number of men under the rule of law. The state is established for a moral reason, the necessity of justice. A state may be more or less effective in maintaining justice and therefore conform more or less to the idea of the state, and therefore a state may be more or less moral. The state must be justified a priori, without direct reference to any empirical premise whatsoever, except that one premise, the imperfection of man. That's the only empirical premise that Kant allows in his argument for the justification of the state. Now, ruled out are all premises concerning happiness, all of which are highly uncertain and belong anyway to the world of appearance, and even premises concerning human nature. It is very odd that the only premise that Kant will accept about human nature is that it is evil. So he does accept this, I think, inconsistently. Now I'm going to insert between 3 and 4 some arguments that I have not mentioned in the outline. The state should be thought of as being formed by a social contract, even though empirically in the world of phenomena no social contract ever took place. But nominally, you see, we must think of the state as having once been established by a social contract. All contracts have in common the feature of being directed toward a chosen end to be pursued by joint effort. The end is shared by all those making the contract. But the social contract, or the original contract, as he calls it, establishing a civil society, has its own unique features. It establishes a union for a common end, which all ought to share as an absolute duty, and it is the necessary condition of all other external duties. The end is establishing and protecting the right of men under coercive public laws, by which each can be given what is due to him and secured against attack from any others. This end, Kant says, quote, is derived entirely from the concept of freedom in the mutual external relationships of human beings. It has nothing to do with the end which all men share by nature, that is, the desire for happiness. Nothing to do with happiness, or with the recognized means of attaining happiness, which on no account must interfere with the laws governing external right. Right is the restriction of each individual's freedom so that it can harmonize with the freedom of everyone else insofar it is possible to do in terms of a general law. A civil constitution is a relationship among free men who are subject to coercive laws while they retain their freedom within the general union of their fellows. This is all established a priori, quote, regardless of all empirical ends, which can be summed up under the general heading of happiness. Now I've come to point 5, C5, the freedom and equality of subjects, and point 6, the independence of citizens. The civil state is founded on the following a priori principles of external human right. 1, the freedom of each member of society as a human being. The freedom of each member of society as a human being. 2, the equality of each with all the others as subject. And 3, the independence of each member of the Commonwealth as citizen. Now that's very abstract. I'll spell this out now. Freedom as a human being. Man's freedom as a human being can be expressed in the following formula. No one can compel me to seek my own welfare or my own happiness in accordance with his conception of what is good for me. Each may seek his own happiness or welfare in whatever way he sees fit, so long as he does not infringe on the freedom of others to pursue a similar end, and which can be reconciled with the freedom of everyone else within a workable general law. That is, he must accord to others the same rights as he enjoys himself. Then Kant says, quote, a government might be established on the principle of benevolence toward the people, like that of the father toward his children. Under such a paternal government, the subjects, as immature children, who cannot distinguish what is truly useful or harmless to themselves, would be obliged to behave purely passively and to rely on the judgment of the head of state as to how they ought to be happy. Be happy in your work, you say. And upon his kindness in willing their happiness at all. Such a government, a paternalistic government, says Kant, is the greatest, quote, the greatest conceivable despotism. That is, it is a constitution which suspends the entire freedom of subjects who henceforth have no rights whatsoever. Next we come to man's equality as subject. The individual member of society has the right of coercion against all the others except the head of state. Get that? Except the head of state, through whom alone the rightful coercion of others can be exercised. Quote, for if he too could be coerced, he would not be head of state, and the hierarchy of subordination would extend infinitely. Unquote. The equality of men as subjects, that is, subject to the same laws, equally under the law, equal under the law, the equality of men as subjects, quote, is, however, perfectly consistent with the utmost inequality in possessions, whether these take the form of physical superiority or mental superiority or more property, and of particular rights of which there are many with respect to others, like marriage rights and things like that. Thus, the welfare of the one depends very much on the will of the other. The poor depending on the rich, the one must obey the other as the child, its parent, or the wife, her husband. Get that order, as the child, its parent, or the wife, her husband. The one serves, he's a laborer, while the other pays, and so on. Nevertheless, they are all equal before the law as subjects, which is the pronouncement of the general will, can only be single in form, and which concerns the form of the right and not the material or object in relation to which I possess rights. However, one can lose his rights by committing a crime. There can be no contract for enslavement. No one has the right to sell himself into slavery, because such a contract would, quote, deprive one of the right to make a contract, and would thus invalidate the one he had already made, unquote. That is, he would be no longer obliged to carry it out, you see. Quote, every member must be entitled by the idea of equality to reach any degree of rank which a subject can earn through his talent, his industry, and his good fortune. And his fellow subjects must not stand in his way by hereditary privileges. That was written against the nobility of Prussia. That's the end of that quote. We now come to point number 6, the independence of the citizen. Kant distinguishes between the active and the passive citizen. An active citizen is a citizen who has the right to vote. He participates directly or indirectly in the legislative process. All other citizens are called passive. The basic qualification for active citizenship is independence, by which Kant means economic independence. Owing one's existence and support entirely to one's own efforts. Only those should be allowed to vote, rather than being subordinate to the will of the other, dependent upon the will of another, and as a result not having to recognize. The independent man, as a result, does not have to recognize anyone's superiority unless he has bound himself by a contract to this person to recognize he is his superior. Examples of active citizens are merchants, professional people, landowners, and artisans. Examples of passive citizens are apprentices, miners, housewives, domestic servants, and laborers. Kant's criterion is that a person is independent if, when any legal question comes up concerning his work, he is represented by himself instead of by a master. He's not acting under anyone's instruction. The function of consultants, you say. The landowner or the merchant is independent because of his right to and responsibility for his property. The professional person or the artisan because he has a right to and responsibility for the exercise of certain skills in a truly professional way. Kant regards land, goods, and professional skills as property. Let us look for a moment now at his concept of property, his theory of property, which I don't think I've mentioned on the outline, but it properly should fall here. Kant defines property as, quote, the mode of having something external to myself as my own. There are, he says, two ways in which we may possess an object. The first he calls physical possession. This marker I am now physically possessing. He also calls it sensible possession because you can all see that I've got it in my hands. I physically possess a marker when I hold it in my hand or have the physical power to get hold of it from someone else, the baby, say. Physical possession he also calls, as I said, sensible possession because it's observable at the sensory level. Physical possession is observable at the sensory level. And you're going to see the great importance here of his distinction between appearance and reality. The other kind of possession he calls legal or noumenal possession. For instance, I may have a right to this marker. You see, if I merely refuse to give it up at the end of the hour and Susan starts pulling on it or something to get it out of my hand, then she's merely trying to physically dispossess me of the thing. And she may get it out of my hand, and it may turn out that after all, I own this, that I brought it with me, that I noumenally possess it. I may have a right to the marker, even though I cannot physically possess it. My having a right is something that is not observable at the sensory level. You can look and look and look, and you can see, hear, feel, and smell, a sharp smell there. None of these things is a property right. And think of all the radical empiricists and positivists who pointed out that you can't see property rights. What are these things called rights? You can't scientifically verify them. Well, Kant says that possession at the sensory level is obviously not a property right. Property right, he's going to say, is possession at the noumenal level. Now, the recognition of property rights clearly calls for resort to the conceptual level, what we call the conceptual level. But the conceptual level in which of its functions? Kant says, in the scientific function, in other words, in the sense of the understanding, applying such categories as causality. I notice that this marker causes a sound, but I still don't see any property even though I don't see any right to property even though I'm using the category of causality. No amount of reasoning about the physics, chemistry, or psychology the physics or chemistry of this marker, or the psychology of its holder, can deliver a single verdict as to who owns the marker. Scientific analysis has no validity in this area, even though we have risen to the conceptual level. We must appeal to the practical use of reason, to practical reason. Practical reason can alone establish who owns the marker. Ownership established by reason in its practical use, Kant calls noumenal possession. Kant is true to his general philosophical position here when he locates sensible possession in the realm of appearances, calling it also phenomenal possession, and when he locates noumenal possession in the realm of things in themselves, calling it sometimes intelligible possession. Both sensible and noumenal possession are necessary to property. Something can be my property only if I both have a right to it and if I have physical possession of it. Thus, property is noumenal in character as well as phenomenal. Now I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the so-called natural right to property in Kant, because Kant says we have a natural right to property. Now, let's see what he means by that. Kant agreed with Locke that the earth was given by God to mankind as a common possession. But from that point on, their thought diverges. Locke believes that the next step was the legitimate acquisition of private property by individuals. The acquisition was carried out by the addition of the individual's labor to common property, thereby making it private, tilling a piece of soil, for instance. Locke called this the natural right to property and said that this, like the rights to life and liberty, was antecedent to the existence of the state. The state was called into existence to protect these already existing, inalienable, antecedent rights. If the state proved unable to protect these rights, revolution was justified. Kant, on the other hand, agreed with the general position set forth by Rousseau in The Social Contract and the essay on the origins of inequality. According to Rousseau's account, the earth was at the beginning common property. Then it was later seized by what Rousseau called the first occupiers, meaning the first private occupiers. Seized out of greed, you see. They had merely physical possession and no right to the land in the full Lockean sense, according to Rousseau. Kant would say that they had merely phenomenal, not noumenal possession. Then, according to Rousseau, came a bunch of looters. When the first occupiers argued with the looters that they were the rightful occupiers by title of their labor and skill, the looters simply presented their title, superior strength. In order to end this chaos, the result of Lockean illusions, man has only to enter into the social contract of Rousseau. According to the terms of the Rousseauian social contract, men in one act alienate themselves, their rights, and their possessions. They simply cede them to society, which promptly gives them back as grants and privileges, conditional upon the public interest. These grants and privileges are rights for the first time when the state gives them back to you, you see. They've been stamped by the seal of the county clerk or something like that. Now Kant essentially agrees with this account, with the account of Rousseau. Phenomenal possession only becomes lawful and therefore noumenal when it is legitimated by the state. And so it is only after men enter into civil society that we have private property. Kant believed that it is only right that there be private property, and only right that we ought to speak of a natural right to property in the sense that those with merely phenomenal possession have a right to have their property claims legitimated as soon as civil society is formed. I have a right to have the claims legitimated. Kant expected that the distribution of property would be unequal. hoped it would be unequal. But he believed with Rousseau that we should think of a moment in the process of the formation of the social contract when the sovereign, for just a few seconds, becomes sole proprietor. Just before he returns the property, you see, sole proprietor. In this modified sense, there is a natural right to property. In Kant's view, however, the state may confiscate property in emergencies. The sole proprietor can take it back, you see. Or, in Kant's view, the state may confiscate property in emergencies, acting as the original sole proprietor. Or the state may break up large estates when their size becomes a threat to the social order, not in response to claims necessarily, but when their size becomes a threat to the social order. In further disagreement with Locke, Kant believed that one cannot found a noumenal right on such a thing as the mere need of an individual, such as his survival. Such a derivation would lack all appeal to universality and necessity, might clash with others. The need of an individual is a special situation. This empirical situation, namely needs of individuals for the means of survival, have nothing to do with purely abstract principles, the kind that bind any society together. Kant believes that any society is better than none, and he is seeking the necessary presuppositions or conditions of society as such. Indeed, mankind has never experienced a state of nature in the sense of empiricists like Hobbes and Locke. However, the state of nature Kant calls an idea of the practical reason, idea with a capital I, which has juridical reality. It makes us think of what it would be like if, impossibly, there were no society at all. It's morally imperative that man have a society, that he live in society, and all of man's rights are derived from this imperative of living in society. It is possible to have private property only in a civil society. Now, the term civil society has been used by the British empiricists, and Kant has taken it over from the British empiricists, but he translates it in this way. I'm going to write the German. Can anyone translate that? Any chance?
Commercial.
That's what Hegel called commercial association. Commercial society in the sense of association, or bourgeois society. Bourgeois society. That's how he translated the term of the British empiricist, civil society, and that's more or less what they meant. Bourgeois society, property owner society, let's face it. This translation, literally bourgeois association or general company of merchants, general company, remember Rembrandt's picture? It was Rembrandt, wasn't it? I think so. It's later, this translation is later to be taken over by Hegel and Marx, to be given ominous interpretations, sometimes in contrast to the concept of, what contrast did Hegel make between association of propertied men and what was above that? Well, yes, Gemeinschaft. That's one of the terms that Hegel used. Gemeinschaft means community as opposed to association. Community with common possessions, sole proprietorship. But that's the other term which he used, Staat. See? Is there a T on the end? I think so. No. That would mean what? City. Right. However, it's important to see that Kant makes no such contrast. Indeed, he says that bourgeois association and the state are the same thing, looked at from two different points of view. The individual's point of view is the bourgeois association, and the state's point of view is society's point of view. There can be no property apart from the principle that everyone in the community, everyone living around the premises, can be forced into civil society. That is, everybody has to be assumed to have made implicitly the social contract. For were it not for this principle, the conditions of my holding property would not be guaranteed as identical with the conditions of other people's holding property. We would not then be bound to leave other people's property untouched. This principle of the right to force all into civil society is an idea of practical reason, not an actual empirical signed contract. So in the state of nature, there is a natural right to own property, with the understanding that this right and this property are only provisional in anticipation of civil society, a society which all may be forced to enter even if the majority dissent. It is everyone's natural right to force even a majority to be free in bürgerliche Gesellschaft. In a strict sense, this is the only natural right, and there are no other rights antecedent to the founding of civil society except the right to force people to be free. Kant agrees with Rousseau that in the latter's words, the words of Rousseau, quote, "In order that the social contract may not be an empty formula, it tacitly includes the undertaking, which alone can give force to the rest, that whoever refuses to obey the general will be forced to do so by the whole body. This means nothing else than that he will be forced to be free, forced to be free. For giving each citizen to his country is the condition, giving each citizen to his country is the condition of securing him against all personal dependence." So that Kant holds that civil society and the state are the same relationship looked at from different points of view. The 2 points of view are, according to Kant, perfectly compatible because the state provides the individual with protection to pursue his egoistic goals, while at the same time providing society as a whole protection against social disorder. Bürgerliche Gesellschaft and state are therefore the same thing. This is in sharp contrast to the views of Hegel and later idealists. Unlike Hegel, Kant does not regard the state as an entity higher in intrinsic value and importance to the individual or individuals of which it may happen to be composed. He would reject, therefore, the organic view of the state. The state is important only as a means to the freedom and rule of law it provides the individual citizens. The common interest or public interest is an aggregate of the individual interests. Here Kant differs from Rousseau, who regards the general will as a kind of mystical interest in the public good, which all citizens share. When Kant uses the term general will, he means the actual decisions of the existing ruling agency which the citizens are to regard as the embodiment of their interest in the role of justice. Now I come to the point of resistance to the state. Does the citizen have the right to resist the state? The sovereign power of the state, whatever it may be, has many rights, but no coercive duties. Furthermore, if the ruler, who is the organ of the sovereign, proceeds contrary to the laws, for instance, in imposing taxes or recruiting soldiers so as to violate the law of equality in the distribution of political burdens, the subject may lodge a complaint about this injustice, but he may not put up any resistance to it. All the subject can do is to lodge a complaint and wait for the sovereign power to answer the complaint. It is, Kant said, self-contradictory to act against the law that we have from a moral point of view created. So, if we believe that the sovereign's acts are unjust, you say, we have the right to complain, but that's all. We have no right to institute action against him, because who would be the judge of who was right, the sovereign or the subject? You see, you would then have a judge, which would be another sovereign. So the sovereign is always right. Kant actually believes that there should be a division of powers. He believes in the three powers: executive, legislative, and judicial. But he believes that the legislative power should be sovereign in the state. Now we come to the topic of social welfare. Kant's general position on the nature of the state led him to a rejection of paternalism. We've seen this. And to the conclusion that the state should not intervene in the marketplace. In other words, it led him to classical liberalism. Classical liberalism of the type that denies inalienable rights. This is indeed Kant's main stance in political philosophy. And when I said that his political philosophy was consistent with the rest of his philosophy, I was referring to this main position of classical liberalism of the type that denies inalienable rights. But that does not mean that there are no elements in his political philosophy that are themselves inconsistent with classical liberalism. One such instance is his advocacy of welfare in some minimal form. He says that, quote, "the helpless poor must be fed, and if they are children, they must be cared for. Why? Because we are men and not beasts. This flows," he says, I'm still quoting, "this flows not from the rights of the poor, but from their needs as men." In other words, a need is a political claim here, you see. A need is a claim. Not only is it a moral claim, but it's a political claim. Unquote. Now, since the state's function is to enforce the rights of citizens and no more, and since Kant is admitting that the poor have no right to be fed, it might seem that Kant is here asserting some alleged moral duty on the part of individuals to feed them. But no, he's asserting the state must feed them. So he is here departing from his principle that the state has no function in the area of purely ethical duties. So this is an instance of the inconsistency I just mentioned. However, this appeal to ethical principles is not the only argument that Kant offers in support of welfare. He has an additional argument drawn from the premises of his political philosophy, and here are his exact words in the Metaphysical Principles of Justice. Quote, "The nature of the state justifies the government in compelling prosperous citizens to provide the means of preserving those who are unable to provide themselves with even the most elementary necessities of nature, because that is the prosperous citizen's existence itself, their existence is an act of submission to the protection of the Commonwealth and to the care it must give them, the prosperous citizens, to enable them to live. They have committed themselves in such a way that the state has a right to make them contribute their share to maintaining their fellow citizens," unquote. Now, this is an important passage because it's an appeal to man's alleged need of the state in order to survive, a premise of the social contract theory that Kant has derived from Rousseau. Now, this premise was meant by Rousseau either in a very foolish sense or as a sly threat. The very foolish sense would be to assert that the independents need the dependents in order to produce enough to survive. The sly threat is that the independents need the agreement of the dependents not to kill them. I think that this is Rousseau's real meaning, the sly threat. He's a sly character anyway, and frequently spoke with his tongue in his cheek. I think this is what Kant is referring to when he refers to the care the Commonwealth gives the prosperous citizens, quote, "to enable them to live," unquote. Kant also believes that the government must guide the national economy and finances. Here he is speaking of a limited interference conducted under the supervision of the taxpayers' representatives. He bases this right of interference on that moment in the social contract when the government became the overall proprietor, the universal proprietor of the land and all its fruits, just before it was parceled out as private property. For, he says, this original government ownership is the basis of today's property rights. In other words, the government acted as homesteader under the conditions that the property be used to serve the public interest. So Kant is appealing here not to an ethical premise, but to a premise of political philosophy based on the alleged function of society as such, an antecedent to the fixation of the exact role of the state. One important point that Kant forgot here is that a moment after everyone has submitted to society, together with all his property, society might well ask the question whether we ought henceforth have any private property at all. Why homestead? Why not cover the country with national parks and turn all citizens into rangers? This point was grasped by a modern disciple of Kant, John Rawls, who takes this up in his concept of the original position in his theory of justice. What counter-arguments can be used by a modern classical liberal who does not believe in inalienable antecedent rights? What counter-arguments can be used except pragmatic ones? Okay, now I'm coming to the end, Kant's theory of punishment. I didn't deliberately put punishment and marriage together there under one heading, but came out that way. Kant's theory of punishment. Coercion is the essential activity of the state. The possibility of its use is a crucial article of the social contract. Coercion necessarily involves punishment because some people do it before you can stop them. Kant is an adherent of the retributive theory of punishment, the retributive theory of punishment in all areas, including those outside the sphere of the state. Spare the rod and spoil the child. The punishment should have no end other than the fact that the offender deserves it in virtue of his act. The law of punishment, Kant tells us, is a categorical imperative called for by the dignity of the individual. He has a right to be punished, in other words. Quote, "Woe unto him who rummages about in the winding paths of a theory of happiness, looking for some advantage to be gained by releasing the criminal from punishment or reducing the amount of punishment. Following the Pharisaic motto, quote, it is better that one man should die than that a whole people should go to its ruin, unquote. For where legal justice perishes, then it is no longer worthwhile for men to remain alive on earth." That's what makes it worthwhile remaining alive on earth, the fact that some people are punished, you see. Now, a criminal, close double quote, a criminal who offers his live body for a dangerous medical experiment in place of execution should be refused, for if the criminal survived and provided valuable scientific knowledge to the community, justice would still not be saved. He will have lost his dignity and harmed the community. My liberty and security should be visibly demonstrated to be dependent on my respecting the liberty and security of others, so that if I commit a crime, punishment should be as automatic as possible. In consenting to live in society, I am implicitly accepting any punishment I can. The main function of punishment is to compensate not the individual that has been injured, but to compensate society. The thief forfeits his right to property, and the state can only guarantee his livelihood if he can put his labor entirely at the disposal of the state. for whatever time is judged proper. For taking the life of another, the death penalty is mandatory. Not executing a murderer leaves a blot on the community, on the honor of the community. Quote, even if a civil society were to dissolve itself by common agreement of all its members, get this, if a society were to dissolve itself by common agreement with all its members, the last murderer remaining in prison must first be executed. So that everybody will duly receive what his actions and worth deserve, and so that the blood guilt thereof will not be fixed on the people because they fail to insist on the carrying out of punishment, unquote. All obedience, now this point is not made in so many explicit terms by Kant, but it's made by a commentator named Murphy who wrote on Kant's theory of right. All obedience to law is sacrifice. I believe that Murphy is right in making this estimate. All obedience to law is sacrifice. Sacrifice of the satisfaction of your lower impulses, which sacrifice is owed as a debt to all the others who are sacrificing for you in helping to maintain you in security. If you do not choose to sacrifice by obedience to the law, by God, you must sacrifice by paying the prescribed penalty. This is the meaning of paying one's debt to society. Point made by J.G. Murphy in Kant, The Philosophy of Right. Also, society owes it to the dignity of a criminal to insist on his discharging his debt by full punishment. Otherwise, the guilt will be visited upon them. The blood guilt, you see. Now, Kant then lists some exceptions, 3 exceptions. First, where the number of conspirators is so large that to execute them would leave the streets running with blood and thus endanger the stability of society and the continuity of the government. Saddam Hussein has already shown Kant how to have the streets running with blood and thus to ensure stability and continuity. Another exception is dueling. The challenger in a duel had no choice but to defend his honor and his pride when his pride has been deeply wounded, and the other party must then defend his honor. No murder can take place, quote, in a combat openly fought with the consent of both parties, unquote. Laws against dueling are barbaric. Now you know the explanation of all those dueling fraternities in German universities. A third exception is this. You remember reading in the paper a couple of weeks ago, a young girl, about 15 years old in New York, gave birth to a child and then put it down a garbage chute of some sort where it almost got ground up. They just stopped it in time. A third exception, Kant says, is where a mother kills her illegitimate child. Here, no punishment should be given, for the mother has already lost her honor by bearing the child. And the loss of honor is a greater punishment than death. As for the little bastard, he has no rights, for he has, now these are Kant's words, he has crept surreptitiously into the commonwealth, much like prohibited wares, so that its existence as well as destruction, the child's existence as well as its destruction, can be ignored, because by right it ought not to have come into existence in this way. Okay, now go on to marriage and the role of women. Sexual relations are per se animal relations. Their chief property, their chief characteristic is, quote, to debase mankind and to bring it closer to the animal kingdom, unquote. Lust reduces man to a mere thing, incompatible with his dignity and worth as a human being. The only human form which sexual relations can take is within marriage. The function of marriage is not merely for procreation, but for the satisfaction of these low animal desires in the form of a human relation. Marriage is a contract in which the partners acquire the right to the, quote, possession of an external object as a thing and to its use as a person. The partners own each other, but this does not result in any change in their civil rights. The partners treat each other as things in any sexual relation, according to Kant. This contradicts the individual's moral right of being treated as an end in itself. If it were not for marriage, both parties ought to be ashamed of themselves. However, marriage, by the fact that it is a contract for a possession that is A, mutual, and B, exclusive, cancels the shame and raises the possession to a noumenal level. Since the man is superior to the woman in physical strength and courage, it is to their common interest that he have the right to command. Both in the marriage and in their relation to society, the man is dominant. But the woman makes up for her pro forma inferiority by exercising an informal domination, as dominatrix, you see, over the man in domestic matters. She is the master in domestic quarrels because, quote, nature has provided her with loquacity and passionate eloquence that altogether disarm the man. I think I'll postpone the conclusions to the question period. I stop on that note.
Why don't we take a short break? Okay.
Okay.
We are on.
Francisco?
Given the point you make here in A2, conflict philosophy consistent with the rest of the system, would it be accurate to ascribe to you the view that there is not one and only one justification for, let's say, a classical liberal political philosophy? And if this is so, could you explain why you don't hold such a view?
Well, I should think the burden of proof would be on the person who maintained that there was only one set of premises from which any view could be derived. The history of philosophy is replete with justifications of idealism or realism or something else, some other ism, on the basis of premises that differ wildly from each other. Kant, the vital link in his system is the fact that the state cannot inquire into the motives of people in order to maintain harmony. So given all his false premises, and that premise, which is largely true, which is true, you can see how he arrived by a valid argument at a defective conclusion. So, in a defective argument, he arrived at a truth, but the truth is merely hanging there on his premises, some of which are false.
Right. What motivated my question was that it appears that a good deal of objectivist thinkers, philosophers, would think that although many rationales or systems might be given to justify the classical liberal philosophy, that only one, in fact, does justify it.
Oh,
and that
yeah.
That would be objectivist metaphysics, epistemology, and ethical philosophy.
Only one, in fact, does it.
That the interpretation up to now given of Kant's political philosophy and its relation to his more basic philosophy, in his ethical works, was that it was in fact an aberration, or it was wholly inconsistent with that basic philosophy.
Well, that's false, and I think I proved that. Yes?
Follow up on that a little. Do you think then that it's wrong to speak of a classical liberal tradition which would include a Kantian version, a Lockean version, a Millian version, and so on?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I really don't know what to say about that. It's a tradition in which various people holding the same conclusions derived from different premises met over generations for discussion, cocktails, concerted political action, and so on. I doubt that one can say that there is a classical liberal tradition in the strict sense that there's an Aristotelian tradition, because the premises from which they derive this conclusion of the limited state are so varied in their nature, you see, that their ultimate commitments, their major premises are so different. When you have a developing tradition like Platonism or Aristotelianism, you have between various mutually dissenting members of the school, you have a common commitment or common loyalty to certain ultimate premises. Now, this is not the case with classical liberals. You have utilitarian classical liberals, you have Hayekian classical liberals, you have Rothbardian classical liberals, and heaven knows their premises are all very different from each other. Is that, Roger, with that?
Yeah. That I would say, I just wondered if you thought.
Yeah, you agree. Yes.
Kant introduced apparently the concept of honor when we were talking about the woman who was dishonored by having an illegitimate child. I don't see how that concept fits into his philosophy. It seems straight out of
What is his argument for that?
sexual morality. What is honor?
His appeal to honor was in two of the cases. Remember, the woman with the baby and the dueling. According to him, the concept of honor is antecedent to the loyalty which we owe to the state, because the loyalty which we owe to the state can only be framed in terms of the concept of honor, preserving our honor and by being loyal to the state. It's a prior a priori principle, and so therefore it prevails over loyalty to the state. And as a matter of fact, he says that the state should be very careful not to enact laws that force people to act in a way which they think is dishonorable, because that's the beginning of the breakdown of society. So that's the argument he used.
It's a sense of moral duty, then. I mean, it's a sense of one's obligation to one's moral duties. How can someone else insult that?
How can someone
else insult that? I mean, how can you insult my
insult?
person? Yeah, that's the provocation for a duel, is an insult to honor. I mean,
yes. Well, the example he uses is confined to military men, and so I suppose that the typical insult would be, "You're a coward."
Yeah.
Now, a coward is somebody who is willing to take his life as the primary value rather than his obligation to duty, which is based in turn on honor, you see? That's the argument that Kant actually did give. Walter?
Was Kant looking particularly hard at what was happening in Prussia, or was he? I believe he died in 1776.
Oh no, that's when Hume died. Kant died about 1804.
Okay, so he was looking at the American Revolution and
He-
French Revolution
He doesn't say.
first.
I don't know that he says anything anywhere about the American Revolution. He had views on the French Revolution.
Was he looking? Was he trying to solve? Was he essentially trying to take a lot of pieces of the puzzle that Rousseau and others had left and put them together, or was he looking at what would happen in Prussia under his view? Was there much of an empirical element in his thinking? in looking at problems in Prussia like states?
The empirical element made him very careful in what he wrote. That's about the only empirical element. He was afraid of that he would be entirely shut up by the King of Prussia. Now, his actual attitude toward the state was one of reserve. For instance, he was applying for a full professorship at a moment when the Russians came in and invaded and captured Königsberg. He merely changed the address of his petition to the Tsaritsa of Russia, Elizabeth, and petitioned her to make him full professor in the University of Königsberg. That's one of the little-known facts about our Immanuel. Alan?
Yeah, going back to that issue of honor, it sounds a lot like, was he influenced by Rousseau's whole concept that the worst thing you can do to somebody is dishonor them, is hurt their feelings?
Look down upon them.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's an interesting
Because it's
line of
almost like
thought.
the Oriental concept of losing face.
Yeah.
Same kind of thing.
I suspect that they were very different. Kant would regard it as dishonorable not to work. Rousseau would regard it as an insult to have that fact called to one's attention. You know what Rousseau used to do on country roads?
That's a leading question.
There's a lot of things.
He used to moon at passers-by.
Did you get that from Johnson's Intellectuals?
From what?
From Johnson's Intellectual, Paul Johnson?
Oh, no. Is that in there?
No, it's just...
It sounds like it.
Yeah, it sounds like something.
I don't know where I got it. I don't know where I got it. I think it's in his Confessions. Which would be straight from the I don't know what's mouth. Rousseau is all for visibility. David?
I like to go back to a point Francisco raised. It is something that's been a position taken within objectivism and stressed at different extents by different objectivists. That's a point of contention among us in the sense as to whether and to what extent you can get the same conclusion from different premises.
Yeah.
And without mentioning names, we've had some debates on that score. Clearly, you can say, as you did in answering Francisco, that to acknowledge that you can get the same conclusion from more than one set of premises is only a logical point, because if the premises are false, those other premises are false, you don't have a good justification. So it's not that you can have many justifications for the same conclusion.
Right.
That's a very good justification.
Right.
The premises have to be true and the logic has to be sound.
Right.
But even so, and I think logically, one has to insist, though, that if the premises and the conclusion are different principles or propositions, that unless we adopt some kind of extreme coherence theory, that it is possible to distinguish what's being stated in the conclusion and distinguish that from the reasons being on the point. Nevertheless, couldn't you say that when you get down to the levels of nuance and detail, the premises you start from do affect the very meaning of the conclusion you arrive at, such as in Kant's, as you pointed out, I think an example would be the concept of negative freedom. When Kant gets to the defense of freedom, where he is defending it not on the basis of any teleological purpose, any life-related, happiness-related purpose in this world, but simply a freedom of action that's not based in this world. Then the primary thing is simply to avoid imposing purposes on other people, and thus you get the concept of negative freedom.
Yeah.
Which is not quite the same concept, roughly the same, but it's not quite the same as what we have.
Oh, no. No, I would be very concerned. I'd be very concerned to point out the radical difference between those classical liberals who believe in inalienable rights and those who, like Hayek, try to assert this formula of Kant's. It's a different concept of freedom, but it might lead to a similarly limited state. And I think where you have different concepts like that are very close together with one term being used for them both, and so that the concept can call for the same set of circumstances. For instance, Milton Friedman's arguments might call for approximately the same kind of economic system that Ayn Rand's arguments do. And you might enter into political alliance with Milton Friedman. Don't.
Well, right. Whether you want to enter into an alliance with someone with different premises,
Right.
That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, but I know. But my point here is that classical liberals, when they have met together, have largely been meeting to promote an alliance rather than a common concept. And that's why I answered Roger that there's no, in my opinion, there's no real dynamic tradition here. It's just an alliance based on the shifting sands of conclusions that have been derived from different premises. And these conclusions themselves may contain terms with slightly different meanings or widely different meanings in some cases.
What makes then Kant a classical liberal, and what sort of would put him under that category as objectivist might fall into that category?
I would
simply that all classical liberals, at least minimally, share a belief in a limited state. Is that what is essential to that categorization?
I am using the term in that way as a kind of a pseudo-genus, not a real genus that's held together by a real common principle, but a sort of a grab bag of people who have come to the same or very similar conclusions on the basis of different premises. Now, you can sometimes talk fruitfully to people who hold the same conclusions that you do on different premises. You may, by logical argument, lead them to abandon their false premises and to adopt true premises after they've thought things over. Because sometimes they may even have subconsciously true arguments in their mind, and they may have just picked up some justification along the way. See?
I think a good example of the same conclusion reached by different premises having ramifications down the road is, I understand that the president of the Mises Institute came to the defense of this police chief in LA based on law and order being a value.
He did.
Now there's an
The
example.
value in question was beating up people in the backs of vans. That was the value.
Well, but if you start with individual rights as your backdrop, you're not going to even entertain that, versus somebody who says, well, the workings of society is the justification
Right.
for liberalism.
Right.
I said that because there's a presumption in Rockwell's argument that the people who are beat up are criminals. And so the
And
value,
he knows that a priori.
how that is known doesn't enter into his argument. They're in the back of the van,
And the
aren't they?
police are executing a sentence.
That's right.
How did Kant feel about victimless crimes, prostitution, drugs?
Drugs, I don't know. In fact, I wonder if he'd ever heard of drugs. Prostitution. He claimed that in one place he claimed that was putting a woman in an unjustifiable situation because she had so much competition. And that was one of his arguments for marriage, as a matter of fact, that you were committed to one and only one person. And this.
Was he married?
Can't you tell?
You had a question before I interrupted.
Yeah, now my questions continue for everyone. I'll stick to the one I had in mind. Where he says regarding marriage that marriage is necessary because it kind of needs the imprimatur of the state to give it kind of
Yes,
honor.
he does say
Is
that.
there a parallel there between that and his notion of property rights?
Yes, there is, because he regards the wife and the husband as the property of each other. The wife is more the property of the husband because he's a full citizen and she's not. There's a very good parallel there.
He said property rights require both sensible and legal protection.
Yeah,
So where would the property of an idea, the original idea, come in?
I don't know. The property to an idea. I don't think Kant talked about the property of one's own mastery over subject matter was the closest he came to property and ideas. He was defending the academic class here. I should mention a fact about resistance to the state here, which I forgot to bring up. Kant.
Can we